Now before I read this, I want to give you a little bit of the context because what I'm going to share from this passage is one of the more difficult teachings in the Bible. It has some difficult parts. In this passage, we're going to meet a man named Saul, who was the first king of Israel. And Saul had a lot of character flaws. He was insecure. He was impatient. He grew jealous of other people quickly. And Scripture includes a number of instances where it's clear that Saul would rather be liked by the people he leads than to do the right thing. Saul wanted to be liked. And he comes into power, and one of the enemies of his people, the Israelites, is a people group called the Amalekites. And the Amalekites had attacked the Israelites several times over a 100-year period of time. In fact, their initial attack was the one that was the most deadly. In fact, it would have meant genocide for God's people. That was the Amalekites' goal. It was to eradicate the Israelites from the face of the earth. And the only way that Israel survived that first attack is because God delivered them. God gave them the victory. It wasn't a victory that they could get credit for themselves for. God delivered them. And so there's attack after attack. And finally God says to Saul, I want you to wipe out the Amalekites. Every man and woman and child and even their livestock, their animals. And that's the difficult part of this passage. Because I don't understand why a loving God would want to eradicate an entire people group or a nation. We do know from Scripture that the Amalekites were engaged in idolatry, which obviously wouldn't make God happy. We also know that as part of their idolatry, they would sacrifice their children, which upsets God vehemently. So that could have been part of it. Here's what I think, though. I think if you take this book overall, and this is another difficult teaching of the Bible, the general message is that because of our sin, we all deserve death. Every one of us, Israelites, Amalekites, me, you. And the only reason that we have breath in our lungs is because God is merciful and He's loving. And so maybe in the Amalekites we get a picture of what should be based on God's justice. And what we see here this morning is what we get because of God's mercy. Maybe that's the answer to that difficult question. But anyway, God says to Saul, I want you to destroy the Amalekites, and Saul doesn't. Against God's orders, he and his men spare the king. And you say, well, nice guy, he's sparing the king, right? You know why? The king was their trophy, right? They've just won this battle. They bring the king back to the people, and they're going to humiliate him, and they're going to show him off to the people like, yay, look at us, right? We're so great. So they spare the king against God's command, and they also spare the best of the livestock. They didn't have currency the way that we have currency. Livestock was money, right? And so the soldiers planned to keep the best of the livestock. So basically what Saul does is he offers God halfway obedience. He gives God, kind of 50% obedience. And so God sends a spokesperson, a prophet named Samuel, to confront Saul, the king, for his disobedience. And on your own today, you might want to read, what Samuel says to Saul. I'm going to pick it up with Saul's defense in verse 20, of 1 Samuel 15. But, it's never a good thing when you're answering a prophet with the word but as your first word. But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back King Agag. The soldiers took sheep, right? The soldiers, the guys I'm in command of, the soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. But Samuel saw through Saul's smokescreen and replies, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination. Divination is not a word we use. It is essentially relying on the insight from fortune tellers and psychics and so forth. Rebellion, or disobedience against the commands of God, is like the sin of divination, and arrogance is like the evil of idolatry. One of the reasons God is having the Amalekites eradicated is idolatry. And here God's basically saying to Saul, your disobedience is like idolatry. Your arrogance is like idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. He should have stopped right there, but he goes on. But, essentially, I was afraid of the people, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. And he wants Samuel to come back with him because Samuel is recognized as a prophet of God. And if they walk from the battleground back into Israel, where the people can see them, it's going to look good for Saul if he's accompanied by Samuel. Now in this series, we're looking at emotional and spiritual health. And we're meeting Saul this morning because he's a picture of unhealth. Saul is a picture of unhealth. Number one, we see Saul here saying no to self-awareness and self-reflection. I mean, Saul's not concerned with what God thinks. He's concerned with what the people think. And this isn't the only instance where Saul lacks this self-awareness. Prior to this passage, Saul tries to kill a young man named David 6 times. 6 times he attempts to kill David. 3 times in the palace, using his javelin to try to impale David. And 3 times through indirect means outside of the palace. But 6 times Saul tries to kill David, which begs the question, well, was David his enemy? Because then it's understandable. Was David trying to overthrow him? And the answer is no. In fact, David was probably one of Saul's most loyal servants. In fact, David's best friend was Saul's son Jonathan. When Saul went into a depression, David would come to the palace and he would soothe Saul's emotions by playing his harp. And on numerous occasions, David put his life on the line for King Saul and for the people of Israel. The most notable, which most of us are probably aware of, is when David went in the ring against a giant named Goliath. So David was not Saul's enemy, which begs the next question, well, why did Saul try to kill David 6 times? The answer, because Saul felt threatened by David. He was jealous by David's popularity and so forth. And so Saul was what we call emotionally unaware. He wasn't in touch with his emotions. Number 2, this passage indicates that Saul says no to cultivating a close relationship with his God. He says no to cultivating a close relationship with God. Now, if you've ever tried to grow a close relationship with God, and the fact that you're here this morning indicates to me that this is at least part of your attempt, you know that it takes energy. You got to have energy to pray, right? If you don't have energy, you're going to fall asleep. You got to have time to cultivate a relationship with God. And Saul went through the motions of a God follower, but really he didn't make the time and he didn't spare the energy to cultivate his relationship with God such that it affected his outlook on life, such that it affected his heart. And I'll give you an example of that too. On one occasion recorded in the Bible, Saul was told by God to wait 7 days, and second, to wait until Samuel came and gave his blessing, before Saul and his troops would attack another enemy, the Philistines. So, why did God have him wait this long? The only answer that I can think of is because waiting tests our faith. We don't like to wait. I don't like to wait. But it provides us an opportunity to reflect and to grow or not. To grow or not. And Saul grows impatient with waiting, and it's like he's watching his watch, and the 7th day comes, and the day's not even over yet. But when he gets some pressure from his men to, let's get on with this, let's have this battle, let's attack the Philistines, Saul gives in, and he proceeds without Samuel.